The fluorescent lights of Pete's diner buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting a sickly yellow glow across the peeling vinyl booths. I'd been here for hours, watching my reflection grow more haggard in the grimy window, while steam curled up from endless cups of bitter coffee. The place reeked of burnt toast and decades of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the walls, creating that uniquely depressing atmosphere only truck stop diners seem to achieve. The clock above the counter read 2:17 a.m. when Dennis slid into the booth across from me. His face looked worse than I remembered. Deep lines carved into leathery skin, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He'd aged a decade since I'd last seen him, though it couldn't have been more than a year. "Still running routes, Greg?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel under tires. His fingers drummed an uneven rhythm on the sticky tabletop, a nervous tick I'd never seen in him before. "Barely," I muttered, stirring a third packet of sugar into my lukewarm coffee. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, too loud in the empty diner. "Market's dried up. Been living off savings for 2 months now." I didn't mention the foreclosure notice sitting in my glove compartment, or the calls from creditors I'd been dodging. Dennis nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. We'd done dozens of hauls together back in the day, the kind of friendship forged in endless midnight drives and shared thermoses of coffee. But he'd vanished 6 months ago, stopped answering calls, dropped off the radar completely. Now here he was, looking like he'd been through hell and barely crawled back. "I've got a lead for you," he said, leaning forward. The overhead light caught his eyes, and for a moment, they looked almost black. "Good money. Night work. You interested?" I raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore the way my stomach tightened. "What's the catch?" Dennis's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile. Always a skeptic. He reached into his worn leather jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, stained with what looked like motor oil. His hands trembled slightly as he slid it across the table. "Gas station gig. Middle of nowhere, Montana. $65 an hour. All cash." The envelope seemed to absorb the diner's light, like a black hole sitting there between my half-empty coffee cup and the sticky menu. "Middle of nowhere, huh?" I tried to keep my voice casual. "That's convenient talk for Shady." "You're not wrong," he admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The fluorescent light above our booth flickered, casting strange shadows across his face. "But you're not exactly swimming in options, are you?" I stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. Something about the way Dennis's hands hovered over the table, almost protectively, set my teeth on edge. "Why don't you take it?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. He laughed, a short, hollow sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Did my time there? His fingers unconsciously traced a scar on his wrist I hadn't noticed before. Let's just say I've had enough. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Outside, a distant truck's horn echoed like a warning. "What's the job, really?" Dennis's smile faded, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He gestured to the envelope. "Read the rules, Greg. You'll figure it out." "Rules?" He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the linoleum. "You're going to want to follow them." He pulled his jacket tighter, though the diner was warm, almost uncomfortably so. "Every single one." As he walked away, a cold draft swept through the diner, making the lights flicker again. The bell above the door chimed as he left, the sound lingering too long in the stale air. I stared at the envelope, my fingers twitching to pick it up. When I finally did, it felt wrong in my hands, too heavy, like it was filled with something denser than paper. Inside, scrawled in jagged handwriting that looked like it had been written in a hurry, was a list of 9 rules, each one more bizarre than the last, each one making less sense than the previous. But as I read them, I felt something settle in my gut, a cold, heavy certainty that these weren't suggestions. They were warnings. The drive to Montana stretched endlessly through a landscape that seemed to swallow everything whole. My GPS had died 3 hours back, the screen flickering once before going dark, leaving me with nothing but Dennis's hastily scrawled directions and a map that felt outdated the moment I crossed the state line. Fields of wheat gave way to barren plains, the horizon blurring into nothingness under a sky that looked too big, too empty. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a darkness so complete it felt like driving through ink. My headlights carved a tunnel through the black, illuminating empty fields and the occasional dead tree, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The radio had stopped picking up signals miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of tires and the quiet whisper of wind through a crack in my passenger window that I'd never noticed before. The truck stop appeared so suddenly, I nearly missed the turn. One moment there was nothing but darkness. The next, a lonely island of flickering neon pierced the night. The sign above read Last Fill Station in blocky letters, some burnt out to spell Latifi El Sant-Tion instead. Below it, a smaller sign swung lazily in a wind I couldn't feel. Gas, groceries, garage. The E in garage flickered erratically, like a dying firefly. I pulled my rig into the lot, the tires crunching over what sounded like a mixture of gravel and broken glass. The sound echoed oddly in the still air, each crunch seeming to last longer than it should. The place looked abandoned at first glance. No cars, no other trucks, just endless rows of empty parking spaces stretching into the darkness. The only signs of life were the humming neon and a strange mechanical creaking from somewhere behind the building that reminded me of an old playground swing moving in the wind. But as I killed the engine, letting silence settle around me like a heavy blanket, I caught sight of a dim light coming from inside the store. It pulsed slightly, as if breathing, casting strange shadows across the dusty windows. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment I stepped out of my truck. The air felt wrong somehow, thicker, like trying to breathe underwater. My boots echoed on the cracked concrete as I approached the entrance, each step sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. The interior was a time capsule from decades past, rows of dusty shelves stocked with faded packages, their labels so old I couldn't make out the brands. The linoleum floor was worn to the backing in places, creating paths that led to nowhere. Behind a counter that had seen better days sat an ancient cash register, its metal dulled with age and what looked like rust, though something about the reddish-brown stains made me look away quickly. A man in a grease-stained jumpsuit stood behind the counter, his presence so sudden I had to stifle a startled jump. I hadn't seen him when I first walked in, though there was nowhere he could have come from. His eyes were bloodshot and wary, seeming to reflect the fluorescent lights above in a way that made them look almost yellow. "You the new guy?" he asked without looking up from something he was writing in a ledger. His pen scratched against the paper with a sound like fingernails on skin. "Guess so," I replied, holding up the envelope Dennis had given me. The paper seemed to pulse in my hand, like something inside was trying to get out. He nodded slowly and gestured toward a door marked Garage with peeling black paint. "Tools are in the back. Truck pulls in, you fix it. Simple enough." His voice had an odd quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere much further away than the few feet between us. "What about the rules?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. The fluorescent light above flickered, and for a moment, his shadow on the wall behind him seemed to move independently, stretching and twisting before snapping back to normal. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and I immediately wished they hadn't. There was something wrong about them, something that made my stomach turn. "You follow 'em." The words seemed to echo slightly, though that should have been impossible in the small space. "And if I don't?" He smiled then, a gesture that never reached his eyes and revealed teeth that looked just slightly too sharp. "You won't make that mistake twice." The words hung in the air like a physical thing, seeming to drop the temperature another few degrees. I nodded, swallowing past a lump in my throat that felt like ice, and made my way toward the garage. As I pushed through the door, I could have sworn I heard him whisper something else, something that sounded like, "None of us do." The garage was a cavernous space that seemed to swallow light. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling on a frayed cord, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The movement made shadows dance across walls lined with tools, wrenches, hammers, and things I couldn't identify, their edges gleaming dully like teeth in the dim light. The concrete floor was stained with decades of oil and other substances, creating patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of my eye. The air was thick with the smell of motor oil, but underneath it lurked something else. A metallic tang that reminded me of blood, mixed with an odor I couldn't place, but made my nose burn. A distant dripping sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness, steady as a heartbeat. Drip, drip, drip. The rules were taped to the back wall, the paper yellow with age and curling at the corners. The handwriting matched the note Dennis had given me, but it looked fresher somehow, as if it had been written minutes ago rather than however long these rules had been posted. The ink seemed to glisten wetly in the dim light. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the screen went black the moment I aimed it at the paper. When I powered it back on, the battery had dropped from 89% to 3%. Cursing under my breath, I stepped closer to read, "Last fill station. Night shift rules. Follow them exactly, no exceptions. Rule 1, always turn off the neon sign between 12:17 a.m. and 12:29 a.m. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. If you hear singing while doing this, don't look up. Rule 2, if you see a truck without a license plate pull in, serve it immediately, but never look at the driver. If they speak to you, respond only with 'fill it up' or 'all set', nothing else. Rule 3, do not eat or drink anything left behind by customers. This includes anything you find in the vending machines, no matter how hungry you get. The snacks aren't what they appear to be. Rule 4, if a truck pulls into the garage and honks twice, lock all doors immediately and wait in the supply closet until dawn. Do not respond to any voices calling your name, even if you recognize them. Rule 5, never go outside to investigate strange lights, no matter how close they seem or what shapes you think you see in them. If they start forming patterns, close your eyes and count to 137. Rule 6, if someone asks for directions to a town you've never heard of, send them west and close the station for exactly 1 hour. Draw salt lines across all doorways before reopening. Rule 7, at 4:07 a.m., check the security cameras. If you see yourself on the screen, do not leave the room until sunrise. If you see yourself smiling, lock the door and pray. Rule 8, if the phone rings after 1:43 a.m., let it ring out. Do not answer it. If it rings more than 13 times, unplug it. If it continues ringing after being unplugged, see Rule 4. Rule 9, always leave a full gas can near pump 4 before your shift ends. If the previous can is empty, do not look inside it to check for residue. Additional notes, the bathroom key is in the top drawer. Only use the bathroom between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. If you hear children laughing, ignore it. We don't serve families after midnight. The coffee machine in the break room is for display only. Do not attempt to use it. As I read the last rule, the overhead bulb flickered violently, casting the room into darkness for a split second. When the light returned, I could have sworn the handwriting had changed slightly, becoming more jagged, more urgent. A cold draft brushed the back of my neck, carrying with it the faint sound of distant laughter. The dripping sound had stopped. I checked my watch, 11:58 p.m. Less than 20 minutes until the first rule would need to be followed. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my notepad to copy down the rules, not trusting my phone to work when I needed it. The pencil kept slipping in my sweaty grip, making the letters look distorted, almost like they were trying to crawl off the page. From somewhere outside came the low rumble of an approaching engine. I glanced at the wall of tools, trying to focus on their familiar shapes rather than the growing shadows between them. The engine sound grew closer, and with it came another sound, a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. My watch ticked over to 11:59 p.m. My shift had officially begun. The rumble of an approaching engine pulled me from my nervous pacing. My watch read 12:15 a.m., its digital display casting a sickly green glow in the darkness. 2 minutes until I needed to turn off the neon sign. The rules had been clear about the timing, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. The truck materializing out of the darkness moved wrong somehow. It rolled into the lot with an unnatural smoothness, as if its wheels weren't quite touching the ground. The headlights cut through the night like surgical blades, but the beams seemed to bend slightly, creating shadows that shouldn't have been possible. It was an older model Peterbilt, its once blue paint now a color that reminded me of bruised skin, with a trailer that seemed to absorb the station's lights rather than reflect them. As it passed under the flickering neon sign, my heart nearly stopped. Where the license plate should have been was just a blank dark space that my eyes refused to focus on. Rule number 2 screamed in my mind. If you see a truck without a license plate pull in, serve it immediately, but never look at the driver. The truck came to a stop at pump 3, the engine settling into an idle that sounded more like labored breathing than machinery. The temperature around me plummeted so rapidly, I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. The driver's door creaked open with a sound like screaming metal. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, watching as a shadow spilled out of the cab. It stretched and distorted across the concrete, far longer than it should have been given the station's lighting. The figure that cast it moved with a jerking, unnatural grace, like a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. "Fill it up," the voice said, and my blood turned to ice. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like several voices layered on top of each other, some speaking slightly faster or slower than the others, creating a discordant echo that made my ears hurt. The words seemed to hang in the air, visible for a moment as dark smoke before dissipating. "Fill it up," I repeated mechanically, the only response the rules allowed. My hands shook as I grabbed the pump handle, the metal so cold it nearly stuck to my skin. I forced myself to focus on the simple task: insert nozzle, squeeze handle, watch numbers climb. But everything felt wrong. The fuel gauge spun backward, the numbers increasing in impossible sequences. 66.6, 66.66, 666.66. The air grew thicker with each passing second, pressing against my skin like wet velvet. From the corner of my eye, I could see the figure standing perfectly still, its shape seeming to blur and shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Something about its proportions was wrong, limbs too long, angles too sharp. My watch beeped, 12:17 a.m. Time to turn off the sign. But the pump was still running, numbers still spinning in their impossible dance. Cold sweat trickled down my back as I realized I couldn't do both at once. The rules demanded I serve the plateless truck immediately, but they were also clear about the sign's timing. The figure turned its head toward me with a motion too smooth to be natural. Though I kept my eyes down, I could feel its gaze like ice water down my spine. The numbers on the pump finally stopped. $666.66. All set, I managed to choke out, the words feeling like glass in my throat. Without a word, the figure reached into its coat. What emerged wasn't a hand, or money, or anything I could properly process. My mind simply refused to register what I saw, leaving only an impression of movement and wrongness. Something was placed on the pump, something that ticked wetly against the metal. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the ground as the figure returned to the truck. The door slammed with a sound that had too many echoes, and the engine roared to life. But it wasn't an engine sound anymore. It was something alive, something hungry. The truck pulled away, but instead of driving down the road, it simply faded, like a dark stain being absorbed into the night. I stood frozen until my watch beeped again, reminding me of the sign. 12:18 a.m., 1 minute late. As I rushed to the power switch, a soft singing began to drift down from above. The rules flashed in my mind. If you hear singing while doing this, don't look up. The melody was beautiful, heartbreakingly so, sung in a language that made my teeth hurt and my eyes water. Every instinct screamed at me to look up, to find the source of that otherworldly music. I kept my eyes forward and threw the switch. The singing cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound like wet wings folding. When I finally dared to look at pump 3, there was no sign of the truck's visit, except for a strange black substance where it had been parked. It looked like oil at first glance, but as I watched, it moved, shifting and bubbling like it was trying to form shapes. I hurried back to the garage, but not before seeing one of those shapes become almost recognizable, almost human, almost like a face I knew. My reflection, grinning back at me from the oil that wasn't oil, wearing an expression I'd never made. At 2:34 a.m., the station had settled into an eerie quiet that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. The encounter with the plateless truck had left me shaken, but following the rules had proven effective, even if each passing hour made me question my sanity more. I'd taken to wiping down the store's counter obsessively, the rhythmic motion helping to calm my nerves. The ancient radio behind the register had been playing static for the past hour, but occasionally I could swear I heard voices in the white noise, whispered conversations in languages that made my head hurt. The security camera monitor on the wall showed empty pumps and vacant parking spaces, though sometimes the images would glitch, showing split-second frames of things that couldn't be there. Dark figures standing motionless between the pumps, children playing hopscotch with strange symbols, my own face staring back from places I hadn't been. The coffee machine in the break room had started making gurgling sounds about 10 minutes ago, despite being unplugged. I remembered the note about it being for display only, and kept my distance. That's when the first light appeared. It started as a pinprick in the darkness beyond the windows, like a star had descended to hover just above the horizon. But it grew quickly, impossibly fast, until the entire station was bathed in a light so white it hurt to look at. It poured through the windows like liquid fire, casting shadows that pointed in the wrong directions. Rule 5 thundered through my mind. Never go outside to investigate strange lights, no matter how close they seem or what shapes you think you see in them. I dropped behind the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs. The light intensified until even the shadows seemed to glow, and with it came a sound, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones and made my teeth ache. It was almost musical, but the notes were wrong, playing in scales that shouldn't exist. Then came the tapping, At first it was gentle, like fingers drumming against glass. But it grew more insistent, more rhythmic. The windows began to vibrate in their frames, the glass rippling like the surface of a pond. Through squinted eyes, I could see shapes moving in the light outside. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to bend in ways that violated geometry. The humming changed pitch, becoming deeper, more urgent. The radio's static cleared for a moment, and a voice came through, distorted, but clearly calling my name. It sounded like Dennis, but wrong. Like his voice was being played backward and forward simultaneously. The light began to shift, moving around the building with purpose. I could track its movement by the way shadows danced across the ceiling. Shadows that sometimes had too many limbs, too many angles. It paused at the garage, and I heard the tools on the wall begin to rattle in their holdings. The sound reminded me of teeth chattering. When the light reached pump 4, where I'd left the gas can as required by Rule 9, the humming reached a crescendo that made my nose bleed. The liquid in the can became visible through the metal, glowing like molten gold. For a split second, I saw what looked like handprints pressing against the windows from the outside. Hundreds of them, at every possible angle, some far too small to be human, others large enough to cover entire panes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light vanished, not fading, but simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The humming cut off so abruptly that my ears popped. The radio returned to its regular static, though now it sounded almost like laughter. I stayed crouched behind the counter for what felt like hours, my ragged breathing too loud in the renewed silence. When I finally found the courage to stand, my legs shaking, the parking lot was empty. The windows showed no signs of the handprints that had covered them moments before. But the gas can I'd left at pump 4 was gone. In its place was a small metallic object that caught the fluorescent lights in ways that made my eyes hurt. It looked like a coin, but the symbols engraved on it seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I didn't touch it. Some part of me knew that whatever it wasn't meant for human hands. As I backed away, I heard the coffee machine in the break room start up again. This time, what dripped into the pot wasn't coffee. It was thick and dark and moved on its own, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like letters. I didn't stay to read what message it was trying to spell. By 3:12 a.m., the weight of solitude had become almost unbearable. The truck stop's silence buzzed in my ears like angry insects, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling, or at least, that's what I told myself the sounds were. The garage felt colder than the rest of the station, cold enough that my breath came out in visible puffs despite the desert night outside being warm. I'd been keeping myself busy with mindless tasks, organizing tools that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking. The wrench in my hands was ice cold, its metal surface covered in tiny engravings that hadn't been there an hour ago. Intricate patterns that hurt my eyes if I tried to follow them. That's when I heard it, a gentle tapping sound, like knuckles against glass. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming from the garage door. Tap, tap, tap. Each sound was precisely spaced, too precise to be natural. I froze, every muscle locking up as my mind raced through the rules. The one about knocking wasn't there, but Rule 4 echoed in my head. If a truck pulls into the garage and honks twice, lock the doors and wait in the supply closet until dawn. This wasn't honking, though. This was something else. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded wrong in the empty garage, like it belonged to someone else. The tapping stopped, replaced by the low hum of an engine idling just outside. But it wasn't any engine I'd ever heard before. The sound was too organic, too alive, like something massive breathing just beyond the door. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The tools on the walls began to vibrate, their shadows dancing in ways that defied physics. Some of them looked like they were trying to peel themselves off the wall. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the metal garage door. The engine sound deepened, rattling the tools until they sang, creating a discordant symphony of metal on metal. The sound reminded me of screaming. My heel hit something soft instead of concrete, and I spun around to find the supply closet door had moved. I could have sworn it was on the other side of the garage earlier. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing darkness so complete it looked solid. The humming outside grew louder, then cut off abruptly. For a moment, there was total silence, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. Then came the honks. Honk, honk. Two sharp, deliberate blasts that weren't quite right. Too deep, too resonant, like they were coming from something that was pretending to be a truck. The rules screamed in my head as I bolted for the supply closet, slamming the door behind me and throwing the lock. The tiny room was pitch black and smelled of old motor oil and something metallic. The air was stale and thick, making each breath feel like drowning. I clutched my wrench like a weapon, though some part of me knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. The honks came again, more insistent this time. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay put as the rules demanded. Then the tapping started again, this time on the closet door. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't possible. Nothing had entered the garage. I would have heard the door open. Yet something was out there, just inches away, separated from me by a thin wooden door that suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper. Greg. The voice that spoke my name wasn't human. It was mechanical and organic all at once, like a machine trying to imitate flesh, or flesh trying to imitate a machine. It had that same multi-layered quality as the plateless truck's driver, but underneath I could hear something I recognized. Dennis's voice, distorted and wrong, but unmistakable. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The darkness in the closet felt alive now, pressing against me like wet velvet. Something brushed against my ankle, something cold and smooth that retreated when I kicked at it. Greg, come out. Your shift isn't over. The voice was closer now, as if the thing speaking was pressing its mouth directly against the door. We have so much to discuss, about the rules. The tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I stayed frozen in place, barely breathing, until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the closet's tiny ventilation grate. Only then did I dare to open the door. The garage was empty, but a trail of black fluid led from the center of the floor out into the lot. It wasn't oil. It moved slightly when I looked at it, forming shapes that resembled letters for split seconds before dissolving back into formless puddles. The air smelled of ozone and burning rubber. On the wall where the rules had been posted, something had added a new line in fresh, glistening ink. Rule 10. When you hear your old friend's voice, remember, Dennis never made it home. The ink was still wet and red. The digital display of my watch flicked to 4:07 a.m. with an almost accusatory beep. Rule 7 loomed in my mind like a guillotine blade. At 4:07 a.m., check the security cameras. If you see yourself on the screen, do not leave the room until sunrise. If you see yourself smiling, lock the door and pray. The security office was a cramped closet of a room tucked behind the store counter. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. Not the normal groan of old hinges, but something that sounded almost like words spoken backward. The monitor setup was ancient. 4 screens arranged in a grid, their surfaces covered in a layer of grime that seemed to shift and ripple when viewed directly. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second echoing in the small space. It showed 4:07, but the second hand moved with unnatural jerks, sometimes ticking backward for a moment before continuing its journey. The air in the room felt thick, almost gelatinous, and tasted faintly of copper. My hands shook as I reached for the control dial, the metal ice cold beneath my fingers. The first camera showed the empty parking lot, but something was wrong with the image. The lines of the parking spaces curved slightly, creating patterns that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. Occasionally, shadows would dart across the screen, things too quick to track, moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Camera 2 covered the gas pumps. They looked normal at first glance, but as I watched, the numbers on their displays began to cycle randomly, occasionally showing symbols that weren't numbers at all. The gas can I'd replaced at pump 4 was visible, but its shadow pointed in the wrong direction. Camera 3 showed the garage. The tools on the wall seemed to be arranged in a different pattern than I remembered, forming what looked disturbingly like a face in profile. As I watched, one of the wrenches twitched slightly, like a finger trying to bend. Then I switched to camera 4, the store interior. There I was, standing in the middle of the snack aisle, perfectly still. But I was in the security office. I hadn't been in the store for at least an hour. The figure on the screen wore my clothes, had my build, but something about it was fundamentally wrong. Its posture was too rigid, its angles too sharp. As I watched, paralyzed, the figure's head turned toward the camera with a motion too smooth to be human. Its face, my face, wore an expression I'd never seen in any mirror. The smile was too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear. The teeth visible in that impossible grin were needle-sharp. It raised one hand slowly, pointing directly at the camera. No, not at the camera. At me. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I scrambled backward, nearly knocking over the desk chair. The rules burned in my brain. Do not leave the room until sunrise. I slammed the office door shut and threw the lock, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room felt even smaller now, the walls seeming to pulse slightly with each beat of my heart. The monitors cast a sickly blue glow that made the shadows in the corners look almost solid. On screen 4, my doppelganger had moved closer to the camera. Its smile had grown impossibly wider, and dark liquid, not blood, something thicker and darker, began to drip from its eyes. Its movements were jerky now, like stop-motion animation played at the wrong speed. The other cameras began to show similar figures, all wearing my face, all smiling that terrible smile. They appeared at the pumps, in the garage, in the parking lot. Each one faced the nearest camera, pointing at me. Their mouths moved in unison, silently forming words I was grateful I couldn't hear. The temperature in the office plummeted until frost began to form on the screens. The clock on the wall spun wildly, its hands whirling like propeller blades before stopping completely at 4:07. The air grew so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. From somewhere outside the office came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that didn't quite match any human walking pattern. They moved up and down the store aisles, drawing closer to the office door. Something scraped against the wood, not knocking, but the sound of two long fingers trailing across its surface. "Greg," my own voice called from the other side, distorted and wrong. "Don't you want to see your new smile?" I huddled in the corner, as far from the door as possible, watching the monitors with burning eyes. The first rays of dawn crept through the office window like tentative fingers, turning the frost on the monitors into diamonds. The night shift was officially over, but the truck stop felt different now. changed somehow, as if the darkness had seeped into its very foundations. My doppelgangers had vanished from the cameras when the sun rose, blinking out of existence between one frame and the next. But they'd left things behind. Dark handprints on the walls, strange symbols carved into the floor, and worst of all, a lingering sense that they hadn't really gone anywhere. They were just waiting. I gathered my things with trembling hands, leaving the wrench where I'd found it. The metal had grown hot during the night, and the strange engravings now pulsed with a faint, sickly light. My jacket felt heavier than it had the night before, as if something had slipped into its pockets while I wasn't looking. The morning light streaming through the windows should have been reassuring, but something was wrong with it. The beams bent at impossible angles, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The store's shelves had rearranged themselves during the night. The aisles now formed a pattern that looked disturbingly like a massive eye when viewed from above. As I headed for the door, movement caught my eye. She-Store's security mirror showed my reflection, but it was delayed by several seconds, the movements jerky and wrong. Sometimes it would pause entirely, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me with eyes that looked increasingly less human. I broke into a run, bursting through the front doors into the morning air. The parking lot was empty except for my truck, but even it looked different in the dawn light. The chrome had dulled to a gunmetal gray, and the paint job seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, just like the plateless truck from the night before. As I climbed into the cab, something made me check the rearview mirror. My heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the lot, stood a figure. No, not one figure, many figures, all wearing my face, all smiling that impossible smile. They stood perfectly still, their forms seeming to flicker and shift in the morning light. I jammed the key into the ignition and the engine roared to life, but the sound was wrong. Deeper, more organic, like the thing that had visited the garage. The radio came on by itself, playing nothing but static and what sounded like distant screaming. I slammed the accelerator, tires squealing on the pavement. The figures didn't move as I sped past them, but their heads turned in unison to follow my departure, necks rotating far beyond what should have been possible. In the mirror, I could see their smiles growing wider, wider, until their faces split like overripe fruit. The truck stop receded behind me, but something else took its place. Lights in the sky, bright and white and impossible to ignore. They paced my truck, keeping perfect formation no matter how fast I drove. The radio static organized itself into words. Rules followed, but knowledge gained comes with a price. The voice was Dennis's, but layered with something else, something that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. The lights drew closer, their formation creating patterns that reminded me of the symbols I'd seen carved into the garage tools. Welcome to the night shift, Greg. The permanent shift. I drove faster, but the lights kept pace effortlessly. Sometimes they would swoop low enough that I could see shapes within them. Faces I recognized, faces that shouldn't exist, and things that weren't faces at all. The truck's engine had developed a new sound now, a rhythmic thumping like a massive heart beating. The temperature in the cab dropped until my breath came out as frost, and the windows began to ice over with patterns that looked like screaming faces. From somewhere behind me came the familiar sound. Honk, honk. I didn't need to look to know what was coming up fast in my mirrors. A plateless truck, its paint the color of bruised flesh, driven by something wearing Dennis's face, or what was left of it. The rules had warned us about leaving. They just never mentioned it was already too late once you'd arrived. I'm still driving. The lights follow me everywhere now, waiting. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my reflection in the windshield, glimpses of a smile that grows wider every day. The radio only plays static, but in it, I can hear voices reading out rules. New rules, different rules. And sometimes, late at night when the moon is hidden and the roads are empty, I see the last fill station's sign glowing in the distance. It appears in places where no station should be, calling me back. One day, I know I'll return. We all do.